This is the Conscious Economics Podcast. Your co-hosts are two women who found themselves in careers on Bay Street, but decided that there was something missing. So here we are. I'm Rhiannon Roseland. I'm your co-host and the CEO of the Economic Club of Canada. I'm also the co-founder of Conscious Economics.
Hi, I'm Asil, the CEO of Conscious Economics and a financial therapist.
Now, we call ourselves economic healers, and that is a term that I'm sure nobody has heard before, but we really believe that if we want to heal our systems and create a more equitable society, it starts with actually healing our relationship with money and the economy.
When you join us on this podcast, you'll be exposed to courageous conversations that help us examine, heal, and redefine the relationship we have with money. Join us on this journey as we co-create the new economy together. What's up, Conscious Economics peeps? This is your co-host Asil with another episode of Conscious Economics.
Yes, and I am here, co-host Rhiannon, and we are going to be talking today about something that isn't really talked about very often, but is very, very common, and that is wealth guilt.
So what is wealth guilt? Essentially, it's when people who have wealth feel guilty about it, and that's something you don't necessarily expect because the average person thinks that everybody would want more wealth, or everybody would desire to have more wealth. But actually, some people who do have a lot of shame around that.
Yeah.
And we're here to explore layers to why that is.
100%. I was reflecting on a couple of weeks ago, the Met Gala happened. And the Met Gala is where, a bunch of celebrities and, public figures and folks and artists come together. And it's really about the fashion and about the statement and the art of the fashion. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came in a dress that had tax the rich on it. And it was quite a statement piece. And it was also quite a statement piece because that's who's at the Met Gala, is some of the wealthiest and richest people. So for her to walk through that space with that message on, and, it made me think about wealth guilt when I saw this, because I think that especially right now, with everything that's happening in society, more and more we're seeing the rise of people feeling very, very frustrated with the inequalities of our society. And a lot of the times, a lot gets thrown on to people that have generated wealth as the cause of these issues. And it's a very, very uncomfortable thing. And of course, there's the, multi-billion zillionaire folks, the 1%, but even people who are, I don't even know, like making, not to that level, but just sometimes a normal salary in some ways experience wealth guilt.
Sure.
Yes.
And actually, I'm going to discuss that because even what is your definition of wealthy, or what is your definition of ultra wealthy? I mean, what is that threshold? And it's going to be a different answer depending on your upbringing and your perspectives on life and the type of maybe even the country you live in that contributes to the answer you give. So I think a helpful angle for us to start from, because I have a lot to share on this topic, is let's explore the sources of wealth first. So the sources of wealth, first of all, you can be born into wealth. Second, you can have a financial windfall. And third, you can create and accumulate wealth along your way. Yeah. So each of those creates a different type of guilt and shame associated with it. So let's explore each separately. First,
can I guess which one is the worst wealth guilt?
Yeah, you can guess that.
Is it the people that are born into the wealth that have the worst guilt about it?
I don't think so. I think
really,
yeah, I think it's a financial windfall, and I'll tell you why. Because financial windfalls sometimes happen with insurance or settlements, and often that means the loss of a loved one. And I dealt a lot with that when I was a financial planner.
I see.
People they either inheritance or an insurance money that gets paid in a big lump sum, and it causes a sudden wealth for somebody. But because it's the loss of loved one that causes that, there's so much guilt and shame wrapped up with that scenario.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. For some reason, when I thought of the windfall, I thought of like winning the lottery.
Yes, which is the least common one, though.
Yeah, makes sense now that you say it. But for some reason, that was the one that I thought of. And then I was like, what's what's the prob? You know, you bought that $2 ticket and now you got a couple mil. And that's why I think everyone blows it, because it's like blah, blah, blah. Like, you know,
Yes,
yeah.
there's this thing about mental accounting, and that means depending on how wealth comes into your life, it dictates what you do with it. So you act very differently when you win something or get something unexpectedly versus if you work hard for it. And all these things contribute to the emotions underlying the money in our life, which is really what we're talking about here. So, but let's backtrack and really explore each of these three different categories, because this shame and guilt really is altered based on how wealth came into our life to begin with.
Okay.
So the first one we were exploring is born into wealth. And I feel that one is actually becoming more so the case as the general consensus globally. There's a lot of hate towards ultra rich, and so a lot of the guilt associated with this category is feeling that you have something that others don't, which is truly the case. Feeling a lot of unfairness and injustice in that specific disparity, which is also the case, and feeling like you didn't have to do anything to get the money, and therefore that you don't deserve it as a result of that. There's also guilt associated because of the potential control associated with that wealth, or associated with that expectation. Like usually it's a parent-child dynamic. So because we're giving you all this luxury, we're now expecting these things from you.
Yeah.
So that creates guilt and shame around it as well. And lastly, it's the transmuting of this guilt from the parents to the kids, especially if the parents themselves are ambivalent or guilty about their wealth, or maybe if the ways they've had to accumulate their wealth, they pass that guilt onto their kids subconsciously.
So interesting. I had a boyfriend when I was younger who had a tremendous amount of wealth guilt. He was born into a extremely wealthy family, like very extremely wealthy. And his whole life, he sort of rejected it in every possible way, including even what he ended up doing with his career and the way he became an activist. And I think he honestly dated me as part of that, like, rebellion. Yeah, because I was obviously growing up in the total opposite environment. And I remember we were really young, so like your mom still had to pick you up from the movie theater kind of thing. And I remember when his parents came to pick him up from my house to be like, who's this girl that our son is spending all this time with? And when they saw the home that we were living in, like I could just see it like written all over her face, that she was kind of mortified about it. But he it was just so ingrained in him that he wanted to kind of reject this. And it's interesting. And I've felt wealth guilt, and I don't even know that I was that wealthy when I was experiencing it, but I just finally, when the tables turned and I was generating, you know, a healthy income, I felt very much, I've said this before on the podcast, like I needed to give it away, or I needed to prove that I'm not a different person now. I'm still Jenny from the block. I'm not a different person now, just because I've, you know, quote unquote made it, and that my values around equity and social justice and all these things are the same. And so it's really difficult.
I wonder, one of the theories I have is kids that are born into wealthy families sometimes have a very emotional, distant relationship with their parents, because parents in that environment tend to be workaholics, tend to be you know, hire nannies to do a lot of the child rearing work. So kids ultimately resent the wealth because they associate it with, our parents are not there for us, I'm not good enough, my parents don't love me or don't want me, just because these things are constantly reinforced by having other people take care of them, or having their parents not even around, or also having money being shoved in their face anytime they have a need, and be like, you know, I don't have time for you, but here's the money. Here's the money. So I think all these different layers create that the resentment to that wealth to begin with.
It's a huge source of, you know, psychological, like despair, addiction. Like I've seen a lot of people that have struggled really badly coming from that.
But another layer to it is, I think people who are born in that environment, and I've seen that in clients as well, is wondering, do I have what it takes to create money if I wasn't born in a wealthy scenario? So am I not like deserving is one element of it, but am I capable? Am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Am I gonna measure up to, you know, my father's expectation or my mom's expectations? You know, like if my parents are lawyers and doctors and usually have, you know, very successful entrepreneurs or whatever, who would I have been if I was just born in a average environment or like below average environment? Would I have made it on my own type of thing? Because all your success in that environment is attributed to your parents'
to
success.
that. 100%. I think that happens a lot too when you see like celebrity children.
Yes.
So, you know, your mom's a famous movie star. Now you're coming out into the scene and they're like, you're only there because, you know, your mom was famous. But I actually think those people have it harder because they're just being judged, you know, tremendously
and that's why we need to exercise compassion, because whether you have money, you have a different host of problems. And when you have money, you just have a different host of challenges. And regardless where you fall on that spectrum, because of all these associations that we talk about, we do need to give space and exercise compassion when we're dealing and throwing our own judgments onto people.
And like they said, more money, more problems. More money, more problems. Sometimes
we want to change that though.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think it's true. It's more
I just think everybody has problems.
Lack of awareness around money creates problems is what I really think. Because
100%.
when we start really believing that more money is more problems, on some level we're going to reject having more money, and if we do, we want to get rid of it.
And speak to anyone who's struggling with money and they'll tell you that that's a problem and that there are so much associated with it. But I love the piece that you said about compassion, and that's something that we're really about at Conscious Economics, is bringing all types of folks from all different backgrounds, from all different socioeconomic status together, because we can actually realize that we're more the same than we are different, and that each of us have challenges that we deal with, and each of us have beautiful qualities that we have to, you know, put forward as well. So hold that thought. We have a quick word from our partners before going back to the episode. This podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, RBC Investies. Backed by expert human advisors, RBC Investies is a smart, online, automated investment service that allows you to invest with low effort and low cost.
Open your first RBC Investies account and pay no management fees for your first year. Plus, start investing with as little as $100. Simply visit rbcinvesties.com/getinvesting and sign up using promo code AA407.
And now back to the episode.
So the next one we alluded to earlier is the financial windfall. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of different guilt associated with that one for a whole bunch of different reasons. We already talked about potentially losing loved ones in the process, but let's explore winning the lottery or you know, sudden wealth from wherever it comes from. One of the reasons there's a lot of shame and guilt associated with that is because it removes you entirely from the environment that you are usually surrounded by. Your house changes, your neighborhood changes, your community changes, and your identity changes along the way. So there's a lot of guilt associated because sometimes you're leaving people behind. No, I really didn't think about, obviously the piece that you brought up about inheriting wealth because you lost a loved one. And I can only imagine that if that's the source of a major windfall, because the other thing that happens for people that just get a sudden windfall is it's so sudden, so you actually didn't have time to prepare yourself, your life, your body for this. It's not like it was something that you were working towards over time. So it really is sudden, and there's all of these mixed ideas around what wealth means. And one of the things that I know happens to so many people is all of a sudden people are coming out of the woodwork asking for things, asking for, you know, support, this, that, the other, and it can be very, very overwhelming as well. And then there's guilt and shame associated if you say no, or if you know, don't know what to do with your wealth. And also, where do you go? You know? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last one is obviously creating wealth along the way. But on that, I really want to just give you a short history of wealth guilt and how it all started anyway.
Okay.
So the flashy appearance of wealth really started around the 1980s. So really not that long ago. I was really surprised to hear that.
Really?
And it started in the era where city brokers and Greek shipping magnates popularized the super yacht and technology. And that became the status symbol. And eventually it became even more globalized because of the Russians and the Arabs. And that's around privatization of and oil, essentially, when they started really flashing mansions and jets. And that's now what started permeating what the luxurious rich life looks like. And that's really what started the movement that everybody wanted to aspire to be rich, because now it's associated with being cool and with being more worthy and more wanted and more desired and all these different things associated. But what happened is after 2008, where the global recession took place and the pockets of not just the average person, but also the rich people were impacted, obviously, all of a sudden there was a big shift in rich was no longer cool for some reason. And that specific guilt around that started being even more reinforced when there's like riot happening around the injustices around. There's more awareness on the systemic injustices along the way as well. But there was also a report that was released by the Credit Suisse that said the top 1% of people around the world originally held 42.6% of wealth. But now it's even rising. So the disparity is even
keeps
increasing.
getting bigger. Yeah.
So now it's about 47%. It's increased 5% since that report. And there was another thing I would mention is that the rich obviously are becoming ostracized.
Yeah.
I knew I wasn't gonna be saying that properly. And essentially there was a Oxfam's report that said the thing that's really making them, what's that word again? Ostracized. Yes, is because they are the increase of their pockets is equated with taking away from public services and social protection upon the poorest and most vulnerable. So people automatically associate that if you are becoming richer, somebody else is being worse off as a result of that. Now, whether or not this association is true is irrelevant. It's perception at the end of the day. And that it's very interesting because even recently, obviously, given we live in Canada, there's lots of election talks happening in households and between people. And there was one of the parties that are running here in Canada, their slogan is like, I'm going to tax the rich and I'm going to do all these things. And you start thinking about these layers to it and what that means. And one of the debates that started in my household recently in my family is like, should billionaires even be legal? Because, you know, no matter how much you work in your life, can you even accumulate $1 billion? I mean, the rise of social media and things like that created that possibility, but the majority of the billions weren't necessarily created in the last decade or even 2 decades. It's really generational wealth that was passed from ancient times ago, and that is really built on the shoulders of colonization, slavery, and all these social injustices that took place. So I wonder, like, what we can get easily lost in the weeds when we start exploring these issues from these angles and these layers. But I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a really, really difficult time in the world because, as you mentioned, the disparity between the rich and poor is only increasing. But I would say that there's a lot of things that aren't normal household topics of conversation, like the way that our the way that our monetary policy system is, especially in North America. And when we moved away from the gold standard, there is no finite amount of wealth on the planet. Like they print money.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting piece to the situation. So a lot of it, and I know that the reality is that we're seeing this massive disparity and that there's so much that we need to rework within our systems, social and economic systems, in order to address these issues, and they are pervasive.
Yeah.
But one thing that I do know is that when us, or see, look, I'm already siding with that. I'm not the wealthy. I'm like us folks over here. But it's interesting though that there's so much hate and there's so much that we're consumed with kind of projecting onto the wealthy.
Yeah.
That we kind of forget that we also want that as well, though.
Of course.
You know?
And it's really one of the beautiful
Not
quotes
that we want to be like billionaires necessarily, but we want, most of us want more health and financial freedom in our lives, yet we hate or like despise those who have it.
Yes. Well, I have a few statistics to share with you quickly, but one quote that came to mind as you said that is, despising the rich is one way to ensure staying poor. I forgot who said it, but it was a very interesting realization that I started when my earlier, because I grew up, my dad was a communist. So like speaking of despising the rich was very much ingrained in our household upbringing.
It was ingrained in my household too.
Yeah,
like
for different reasons, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's because it is associated with injustice and greed and selfishness and all these things. But ironically, third of the this study was done in America, not in Canada, but really Canada and America have more or less similar North American type of demographics, I would say. So they did a survey, and third of the rich people, which in that category was people who had from $1 million to 20 million, said they actually hated their wealth, mainly because of how
1/3 of those said they hated their wealth.
Yeah, because of how judged they felt because of it.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who feel very, very embarrassed and shameful about the money that they have, and they try to hide it.
They try to hide it, which was really interesting because even there was a trend on Instagram called the rich kids of Instagram, and I didn't even realize this was a trend because you do hear about this kid who was like 8 years old making more money than I ever will.
Yeah. On TikTok.
On TikTok, exactly.
The algorithms are working for them.
So that trend no longer is cool anymore. It used to be like so cool, but now people have a lot of resentment towards it. But the other study I wanted to show you is a survey by Y Plus, which is a market research firm, and they found that 81% of 13 to 34 years old say that showing off things on Instagram is no longer cool. So even though there was a trend of the rich kids of Instagram that was very popularized, now the younger generation is really starting to shy away from that. And it's no longer cool to wear a shirt that's blingy or to show
finally shopping vintage is cool, and now we're all safe. I wish this was the way it was when I was growing up in school. It would have been so much easier.
Yes, there's definitely a cultural shift for sure that's happening. There's a general disdain towards materialism, and we're starting to see a culture that's shying away from really strong displays of wealth, at least in certain areas. I wouldn't say it's happening in Dubai yet, but
although I mean, it's so interesting. I went into a department store a few weeks ago, and it was a very, very high-end department store, and I literally will not be buying one single thing in there, but I just was looking around, and it was so interesting because a lot of the designer shoes are like, they're super, super expensive, like thousands of dollars, but they're like dirty, like they're made to look like dirty and like super worn in, and like as if you were like skateboarding around town for however long. So it's like, it's so interesting that even that now it's like, it's cool to look like you're not wealthy, but you're still gonna buy all of the things so that you can look the cool way to look, not to be like, we are still in such a materialistic society where we've commodified everything, including like, I just was reading an article the other day, there's a new show that's coming out, and it's called The Activist, and it's like a basically reality TV show with 6 activists that are all activists in different categories, like education, environment, whatever, and they compete with each other to see who can get the most like social media likes, and then get a panel of judges to vote, and the one who gets the most receives money for their cause. And there's been a huge backlash against this, of the commodification now of essentially activism, which takes it's such an interesting time.
It's
and
irony almost.
Yeah, but there is so much hypocrisy in so much of it still, because I know people who have a tremendous amount of wealth that like cultivate the image of the not so wealthy thing, but they're still like paying for that.
There's so many ways we can go. And honestly, this conversation, to bring it back to you, the listener, is a very personal one. Like anytime I go shopping, whether it's online shopping or going to a mall, I always want to ask myself, who am I buying this for? This is a really good question I ask myself anytime I buy something. Is it really for me, or is it for the people around me, or is it for a specific extrinsic cause that I'm buying this for? So just to reflect on your purchases all the time. That's how you can infuse mindfulness in your purchasing, is by asking, do I need it or do I want it? Is it a need or is it a want? Is it for me or is it really for other reasons? If no one's ever going to know about this purchase, would I still want it? And just starting to infuse this type of training your mind to think about this makes your purchasing power more intentional, and really strips you away from the guilt and the shame associated with wealth and with money and all these different categories. But honestly, we can talk for hours, but we do need to wrap up this episode. And like I said, my invitation is to take what you can from this and think about, how can I now implement these findings in my life? How can I implement a more intentional, healthy way of valuing money, but in a way that really is an alignment, an expression of who I am, versus getting lost in the weeds of all this really negative emotion, I would say.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week on Conscious Economics. Check out our website, www.consciouseconomics.ca, to find out more about our organization. This podcast is brought to you by CPP Investments. At CPP Investments, they never lose sight of the long term. They invest the Canadian Pension Plan Fund to help provide financial security for generations of Canadians.
They diversify the CPP fund across geographies and asset classes to access the best investment opportunities and generate sustainable long-term returns. The fund is now more than $400 billion.
To learn more about their investment performance for Canadians, visit cppinvestments.com.